Hey, it's Soul with news, opinions, and analyses. Last week I did a piece on loot distribution where Master Looter was changed to Guild Master Looter after the 703 patch. At the same time, personal loot is now made tradable provided that the item level of the recipient doesn't go up. Yeah! But, while this is a great quality of life change for pugs or otherwise fans of the personal loot system, this inspired a concern, maybe even a drawback if you want to call it that. You see, since 2004, the way rewards have been distributed, notably gear rewards, have changed and shifted in a way that the feeling of gearing up your raid feels a little bit faster, depending on the dedication you put into it. We're going to take a look back to just what these changes and systems are, and when we're through, maybe you'll draw your own conclusions. As for my opinion on this matter, I think raid teams do in fact get so much gear from raids to the point where content is cleared faster than it ought to, leading to boredom for having completed raids too quickly, and or burnout from farming and completing these same raids over and over and over again. But you might say I'm full of it, and depending on where you're coming from, you could be right. Players' feelings on this topic will be different depending on when you started playing, what content you're interested in, your playstyle, and well, all the other factors that make each of us different. First off, I want to make clear what I'm talking about. I'm talking strictly about raid rewards and not so much about gearing up for entering these raids. So I'm not going to mention stuff like catch-up mechanisms or progressing through the same raid in multiple difficulties, so hopefully the message won't get too confusing. So I'll provide a starting point, and we'll go all the way back to 2004 when you were probably running Windows XP, Usher was at the top of the Billboard music charts, and WoW's toughest raid content included Onyxia the Black Dragon and Molten Core. In these raids, between the 40 players on a raid team, bosses drop 2 to 3 pieces of loot. 2, maybe 3, for 40 players. It's the super scarce number of drops that brought over EverQuest's Dragon Kill Point or the DKP system to manage loot distribution by gear value and attendance, or through more social measurements like how sexy is your voice, or if you're married to the raid lead. Even more harrowing were the first tiers of raid gear, which numbered at 8 pieces per set. There's no Protector or Conqueror token or anything like that, so it was more likely that tier would drop that wasn't very useful. At least tier wasn't class restricted at the time, so mages could wear warlock gear for example, but there was no bonus to be had. The only respite during Classic didn't come until after the launch of Blackwing Lair, with the introduction of Zul'Gurub and the Ruins of Anchorage, which had similar itemization kind of, but basically added the amount of gear obtainable in a raid week. For the few teams who managed to complete classic raid content, even among their rosters were players who didn't have complete sets of gear, due to the extremely low number of possible loot gains to be had at the time. Getting gear was one part luck and one part trusting that your raid leader wouldn't shaft you, and unfortunately that happens even almost 12 years later. The Burning Crusade changed things up quite a bit. Aside from scaling down from 40 to 25 players, a new loot calculation was made, 1 drop for every 5 players. So 25-man groups saw 5 drops while 10-man groups saw 2. It was also at this time when tier tokens were introduced as well as PvE currency. Tier tokens made huge strides to ensure that a single drop could cover 3 classes at the time. Early PvE currency like Justice tokens didn't make a critical difference on raid drops then because with few exceptions, raid drops were still that much more powerful. Throughout the rest of WoW's history though, PvE currency did at times allow players to buy raid level gear that made actual drops somewhat less important, even pointless in some cases. During Wrath of the Lich King, the number of gear drops available per boss was very different, depending on who you asked. If you asked a 10-man group, they'd say 2 per boss. If you asked a 25-man group, they'd say 5. If you asked a hardcore 25-man group, they'd say 7 per boss, and maybe more. Hardcore groups had the advantage of having the largest pool of gear available, because at the time, 10 and 25-man gear was outright different, with 25-man gear having the higher item level on top of that. For example, in some cases, the 10-man heroic trinket is as good or better than any other trinket in the 25-man normal difficulty. It wasn't an uncommon practice for the more hardcore teams to raid both sets of instances for the increased opportunities of gear. Their limits were based on their bandwidth. This would become less of an issue in Cataclysm and beyond, wherein doubling up on instances like this was no longer possible, and the item level between 10 and 25-man instances was made the same. But then we're getting into split rating territory, and while that's not very good for the game either, that goes beyond the scope of this analysis. The amount of gear that drops per boss has gone mostly unchanged since, but we're just getting started with how the value of these drops are measured. Cataclysm continued a paradigm of making every drop count, started once upon a time with the introduction of tier tokens. Cataclysm brought the idea of reforging gear that otherwise might not be of use to a player. Throughout WoW's history were special stats that were designed to fit particular roles, including but not limited to hit rating, defense rating, expertise, spirit, block value, block rating, and more. Just about all of them are gone today, but during Cataclysm these were stats required by some players to a certain point, and any more than that was considered useless. Reforging helped in situations where players had too much of one stat and wanted it shifted elsewhere. Players were pretty pleased that these otherwise crappy drops could be made useful, but it was Warlords of Draenor that did away with most of these stats outright, and was largely why Reforging itself was removed. As the game moved into Mists of Pandaria, LFR difficulty became a thing, but a product of that system came in the form of extra role tokens, or as I like to call them, tokens of false hope. This enabled players to spend a single token per boss kill and get another chance at a gear drop. This chance was dependent on the individual player, but in a raid where all players use a token, it's a safe expectation that at least one extra piece of gear would drop. However, that gear is bound to that player only. As a boon, these tokens could continue to be used on the same boss after subsequent kills. Legendary gear has been around since classic WoW, but the latter half of Mist brought with it a quest line that eventually rewarded all participating players with a powerful legendary cloak. For players who possess one, the killing of a raid boss also spelled out a silent prayer that a cloak wouldn't drop or be given through a bonus roll. This was sort of resolved during Warlords of Draenor because the legendary slot was changed to a ring, but for many non-mythic raiders, a legendary and a crafted ring were the go-to choice of itemization, so we're back to square one. Legendary gear will continue on in Legion and can take up all sorts of different slots, but I'll talk a little bit more on that later. We're now coming on to Warlords of Draenor itself, and some territory that's all too familiar. Crafted gear went through a huge change here. While there's a limit of 3 crafted items that can be equipped at the same time, it could potentially be as powerful as heroic gear, especially because the secondary stats could be randomly rolled into what's most ideal for the player's class and spec. This meant that apart from the Warforged or socketed tertiary bonus, crafted gear negated many drops if you planned ahead. The idea was to craft gear with the best secondary stats possible when that wasn't available in a raid. So for example, if I care about haste and mastery, and no belt from the current raid had these stats, I may just craft that belt and pretty much forget about all the other raid drops. This won't be a huge thing in Legion though, with the reported 850 item level cap on crafted gear. That wasn't the biggest change though. Up until Warlords, plate and mail gear that had intelligence on it was literally designed for Holy Paladins and Restoration Shaman respectively. If they weren't in your raid, well, you're out of luck if those pieces happen to drop. And I'm not a fan of absolutes, but I thought that anyone liked this when it happened. People wanted this changed for years. Warlords did change this, and not only that, allowed the primary stats on most gear to change according to the player's spec, including tier pieces, limiting this scenario to the weapon, trinket, ring, and neck slot. It also made ranged weapons one of the more reviled drops during this expansion. Overall, this was almost universally praised among players. No longer did hybrid classes need to effectively gear twice for a single character in order to cover an alternate spec. The personal loot system was pushed to non-LFR content during Warlords, ensuring that when used, every raid drop was, at minimum, usable by the player that received the drop. Tradable personal loot, unveiled with the 703 patch, allows this gear to be redistributed as I explained at the beginning of this piece. In less than 30 days we'll come upon Legion, and soon after that, Legion raids. And we've come a long way from the 2 to 3 pieces of loot that had to be divvied up between 40 players. With Legion come artifact weapons, so with Legion there will be no raid drops that will fill the main or the offhand slot. Players can equip up to 2 legendary pieces of gear for a given slot, and while individual legendaries may not automatically be a given spec's best in slot item, it's definitely something to consider. Primary stats will no longer appear on items filling the neck or the ring slots, further ensuring that these drops will be useful for someone. Finally, Legion will introduce the Titanforge attribute, part of an upcoming system where gear drops from certain sources, including raids, will have a certain item level range that starts from a base item level that we're accustomed to what equates to the best gear you can get at the time. Blizzard has stated in numerous posts that the system is more like a bonus, and not a slippery slope where a player exclusively doing world quests will gear up anywhere near as quickly as a mythic raider. But for the casual raider, the possibility exists where a quick dungeon run gets you a piece of gear that you'll never have to replace until the next tier. Just about all these changes are good on their own merits. It feels good when a boss drops and every drop is usable. It's a big win for your team's throughput. On the other hand, it really sucks when a boss drops and 0 drops are usable. But when considering all these features, as we approach a paradigm where every boss kill is expected to be lucrative, isn't the need to repeat this content over and over again significantly reduced? Let's summarize. Onyxia dropped, say, 2 pieces of gear once upon a time. Luckily, they're both usable and they're passed out in whatever method works out best. If Onyxia was released in Legion, she'd drop 4 pieces of gear for 20 players, 6 for 30, with the possibility of more dropping through role tokens. One of the pieces is Titanforged to the max, ensuring that whoever gets this gear won't replace it for a few months. 1 piece is the tier token that'll go to one of the 4 token people present. Aside from cloaks and trinkets, nearly all of these pieces will be usable by its recipients regardless of their spec. Weapons won't drop, which helps limit the chance of a spec-specific item from appearing. Some players might have legendary gear and pass on these drops, so these 4 pieces will go to whoever needs them the most. And if the raid felt like it, they can reset the instance, kill Onyxia again, and use role tokens until they run out. With little doubt in my mind, I can say that gearing out your raid is much faster than before, probably more than twice as fast. But do these quality of life changes ultimately benefit the players? Does it compromise the old feeling of progression? And even if it did, does it matter? I gave my opinion at the start, but the only thing I'm arguing for in this piece is to just think about it, question it, and encourage others to do the same. That sort of feedback throughout Legion will help Blizzard either double down or reiterate its direction. And that's it. Thanks for making it to the end. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'm curious what your thoughts are. Leave a quick thing in a comment below, like and sub to show your support for the channel, and I'll see you guys later. I'm Soul. Stay breezy, guys.